There's a psychological phenomenon happening right now, silently, across millions of people, and almost nobody is talking about it. The most emotionally intelligent people you've ever met are invisible online. Not because they're shy, not because they're afraid, but because their nervous system is doing exactly what it was built to do: protect them. See, an empath doesn't just scroll through a feed, they absorb it. Every comment, every judgment, every pair of eyes becomes a weight they carry. And the brain, which is always running a threat detection program in the background, eventually delivers one quiet verdict: the exposure isn't worth the cost. What looks like hiding is actually survival. What looks like silence is actually the loudest form of self-awareness most people will never develop. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on exactly why this happens, what it reveals about human psychology, and why the most sensitive people on the planet are also often the most powerful ones. The moment they decide to be seen, there's something happening inside the body of an empath the moment they open a social media app that most people will never notice, never measure, and never feel. Earth. Why understand? Because it doesn't announce itself with words. It announces itself with a heartbeat that shifts slightly, a breath that becomes just a fraction shallower, a low, almost imperceptible tension that moves through the shoulders and chest before the conscious mind has even processed a single post. This isn't drama. This isn't sensitivity being exaggerated. This is biology running its oldest, most reliable program, the one that was never designed for Instagram, but is being asked to operate inside it every single day. The human nervous system was built for a world that no longer exists. It was built for a world where being watched meant being hunted, and where the gaze of others carried real physical consequence, where exposure, being seen, being evaluated, being judged, was genuinely dangerous. That wiring didn't disappear when civilization arrived. It didn't vanish when screens replaced savannas. It is still there, buried beneath every swipe and scroll, still running its calculations, still asking the same ancient question it has always asked: am I safe right now? For most people, that system has a relatively high threshold. They can post a photo, receive a mixed response, and their nervous system files it away without much disruption. A negative comment stings for a moment and fades. A lack of likes registers briefly and then dissolves. The threat detection program runs its check, finds no real danger, and moves on. Life continues, but for an empath, that threshold is fundamentally different. The system is calibrated more finely, the sensors are more sensitive. And what that means in practice is that the same scroll through a comment section that barely registers for one person can produce a measurable physiological response in another. Elevated cortisol, a spike in the autonomic nervous system, a body that is quietly, invisibly preparing for a threat that exists only in the digital world, but feels entirely real inside the physical one. This is not a character flaw. This is not weakness dressed up in psychological language. This is a nervous system doing precisely what it was designed to do, except the environment it was designed for has been replaced by one it was never built to handle. Social media is, from a neurological standpoint, one of the most complex threat environments the human brain has ever been asked to navigate. It combines public exposure, unpredictable feedback, social comparison, status signaling, potential rejection, and permanent record, all simultaneously, all in real time, all delivered directly into the palm of your hand. For a nervous system that treats social judgment as a survival signal, that combination is not trivial. It is exhausting in a way that is genuinely biological, not merely emotional. What makes this particularly interesting and particularly invisible is that empaths often cannot explain exactly why they pull back from social media. They don't always have language for it. They know it feels wrong. They know that crafting a post and waiting for a response produces a kind of tension they don't want to sit inside. They know that seeing how people respond to others, the criticism, the misinterpretation, the casual cruelty that the internet permits, lands in their body differently than it does for the person sitting next to them. But because our culture has trained us to see this kind of sensitivity as something to overcome rather than something to understand, many empaths quietly conclude that something is wrong with them, that they're too fragile, that they should toughen up, that Earth. People don't feel this way about a simple app on their phone, but here is what the science actually tells us. The brains of highly sensitive people, a category that overlaps significantly with what we call empaths, show measurably greater activation in regions associated with empathy, awareness, and emotional processing. Mirror neurons fire more intensely. The insula, which processes both physical sensation and social pain, responds more powerfully. These are not metaphors, these are measurable, documented neurological differences, which means that when an empath feels the weight of online exposure in their chest, when they feel the anticipatory dread of being evaluated by strangers, when their body quietly resists the idea of making themselves visible to an unpredictable audience, that response has a biological address. Most people treat social media like a free transaction. You post something, people see it, you get a response, and the exchange is complete, simple, costless. A few seconds of effort for a few seconds of connection, and for a large portion of the population, that's roughly what it feels like, a low-stakes interaction that barely registers on the emotional ledger. Earth. But for an empath, that transaction is never free. There is always a cost, and the invoice doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it shows up hours later in the form of a fatigue that has no obvious source, a low-grade anxiety that hums quietly beneath the surface of the evening, a subtle but persistent feeling of having given something away that cannot easily be recovered. This is the part that almost nobody talks about when the conversation turns to why sensitive people disappear from online spaces. The conversation usually stays on the surface. They're afraid of judgment, they don't like conflict, they're introverted. And while those things may carry partial truth, they miss the deeper mechanism entirely. The real issue isn't just what might happen after you post. The real issue is what happens inside you in the process of becoming visible. Because for a highly sensitive person, visibility itself is an energy event. It requires something. It draws from a reservoir that doesn't refill on the same schedule for everyone. To understand why, you have to understand how empaths process the concept of being seen. For most people, posting online is an act of broadcasting. You send Earth information outward into a space that feels largely separate from your inner world, and whatever comes back is processed at a comfortable emotional distance. The self feels relatively protected. The boundary between who you are privately and what you've shared publicly remains fairly intact. But for an empath, that boundary is porous by nature. When they share something, an opinion, an image, a piece of writing, a moment from their life, they are not broadcasting from a distance. They are extending something genuine outward, something that carries real emotional weight, into an environment that is entirely unpredictable and almost completely uncontrollable. And the moment that extension happens, the nervous system begins its work. It begins monitoring. It begins scanning. Not always consciously, might in fact usually not consciously, but the awareness is there, running quietly in the background. How is this being received? Who is looking at this? What are they thinking? What might they say? For someone whose nervous system is wired to pick up emotional signals from the environment around them, the knowledge that an unknown number of people are now in contact with something persona. Earth. L creates a kind of sustained, low-level alertness that doesn't simply switch off. It runs, and running that program costs energy, real, measurable, physiological energy, in a way that is fundamentally different from the experience of someone whose system doesn't operate at that frequency. There is also a layer to this that goes beyond the immediate act of posting. Empaths are, by nature, deeply attuned to the emotional undercurrents of their environment. In a physical room, this means they pick up on the moods, tensions, and unspoken feelings of the people around them. Online, that same attunement doesn't disappear. It simply has nowhere clean to land, because the digital environment is not a single mood. It is thousands of moods compressed and accelerated and stripped of the context that would normally allow a sensitive person to process them. A single post can attract warmth from one person and hostility from another, and indifference from a third, all within the same hour. And for someone who absorbs emotional information as naturally as breathing, that cocktail of competing signals isn't background noise. It registers. Every response, every non-response, every ambiguous reactee. Earth. carries weight that gets processed somewhere in the body, whether the person is consciously aware of it or not. This is why empaths often describe a particular kind of tiredness after engaging with social media that they struggle to explain to people who don't share their wiring. It's not the tiredness of having worked hard or stayed up late. It's a specific textured exhaustion, the kind that comes from having been emotionally permeable in an environment that never stops generating emotional signals, the kind that comes from having extended yourself into a space that gives very little back in the currency that actually restores a sensitive nervous system, which is depth, genuine connection, and the feeling of being truly understood rather than simply observed. There is a fundamental tension at the heart of every empath's relationship with social media, and it lives in the gap between what they are naturally built to do and what the platform is specifically designed to demand. Social media, at its core, is an expression engine. It is architected around output, the post, the caption, the story, the reel, the comment, the reaction. Its entire infrastructure is organized around the earth. The assumption that the primary human impulse is to broadcast, to project, to put something outward into the world and wait for the world to respond. Every notification, every prompt, every empty text box with the cursor blinking inside it is a quiet invitation, sometimes a quiet pressure, to produce, to share, to make yourself legible to an audience, to turn your inner life into content. But empaths are not at their most natural expression machines. They are absorption machines. Their most fundamental orientation toward the world is inward and receptive, not outward and projective. Where the average person moves through an environment and interacts with it, an empath moves through an environment and takes it in, processing the emotional texture of a room, reading the unspoken dynamics between people, feeling the weight of atmospheres that others barely notice. This is not a choice they make consciously. It is the direction their attention naturally flows, and that direction, inward, receptive, absorptive, is almost perfectly opposite to the direction that social media is constantly, insistently asking them to move. This creates a friction that is easy to mistake for laziness or fee. Or a lack of confidence. From the outside, an empath who can't seem to maintain a consistent social media presence looks like someone who simply hasn't committed hard enough, hasn't found their voice yet, hasn't gotten over their self-consciousness. But what is actually happening is something far more structural than that. Every time an empath sits down to create a post, they sit back and let the emotions flow. They are being asked to reverse their natural orientation, to take something from the interior, something that was formed in the quiet, absorptive space of their inner world, and push it outward into a public arena that is noisy, reactive, and indifferent to nuance. That reversal requires effort that isn't visible from the outside, but is very real from the inside. Consider the way an empath typically processes an experience. They don't just have the experience, they sit inside it. They turn it over. They feel its edges. They follow it through layers of meaning that other people might not even notice are there. A conversation doesn't end when the words stop. It continues internally, getting examined and re-examined, understood more deeply over time. An observation about the world doesn't stay on the surface. It goes, Earth. ETs carried inward and connected to other observations, other feelings, other patterns, until something rich and complex has been formed from something that appeared simple at first. This is the empath's native process. This is how they generate understanding, through absorption, through depth, through a relationship with experience that is fundamentally contemplative rather than immediately expressive. Social media does not reward this process. In fact, in many ways, it actively punishes it. The platform rewards speed, the person who posts first, who reacts quickly, who stays visible and consistent and prolific. It rewards simplicity, ideas that can be compressed into a caption, feelings that can be communicated in a single image, opinions that can be stated in a sentence. It rewards performance, the curated self, the polished narrative, the life that reads well rather than the life that is actually being lived in all its complicated, unresolvable fullness. For an empath whose natural process requires time and depth and the freedom to not yet know what something means, every one of those rewards sits on the wrong side of the equation. There is also something more intimate at play. Earth. When an empath does finally arrive at something they want to express, they feel a sense of relief and satisfaction. After all that interior processing, after all that turning and examining and deepening, What they have is not content. What they have is something closer to a confession, something genuine and layered and carefully held. And the idea of releasing that into an environment where it might be misread in 3 seconds, dismissed in 5, or turned into something it was never meant to be. That idea doesn't just feel uncomfortable. It feels like a violation of the process itself, like taking something that was formed in silence and throwing it into a room full of noise and expecting it to survive intact. There is a particular kind of discomfort that empaths carry into every interaction with social media, and it is not the discomfort of being seen. It is the discomfort of being seen incorrectly, of presenting a version of themselves that has been edited, optimized, and packaged for an audience, and then watching that version get mistaken for the real thing. This is what lives at the center of what might be called the mask problem. Not the fear of showing up, but the deep, almost physical aversion to showing up as something other than what they actually are. Because for an empath, inauthenticity is not merely uncomfortable in a social sense, it is uncomfortable in a somatic sense. It registers in the body. It produces a specific textured wrongness that doesn't fade simply because the post performed well or the comments were kind. To understand why this matters so much to empaths specifically, you have to understand their relationship with authenticity in the first place. For most people, there is a relatively fluid boundary between the self they present publicly and the self they inhabit privately. This is not dishonesty. It is simply the normal social architecture of human life. You present differently at work than at home. You perform slightly differently for an audience than for a single trusted friend. Most people move between these modes without significant internal cost because the gap between the performed self and the private self doesn't feel threatening. It feels like a normal part of navigating a complex social world. For an empath, that gap is not neutral because an empath's entire nervous system is organized around the detection of authenticity in others and, crucially, in themselves. Hey are the people who feel immediately, almost involuntarily, when something is off in a conversation, when someone is saying one thing and meaning another, when the mood in a room doesn't match the words being spoken. This attunement is their greatest intelligence, and it operates without discrimination, meaning it applies to their own behavior with exactly the same sensitivity it applies to everyone else's. When an empath performs a version of themselves that isn't fully true, their own nervous system registers the discrepancy. There is no fooling the instrument with the instrument itself. Social media, by its design, creates enormous pressure toward performance, not always in an obvious, cynical way, but in the quiet, cumulative pressure of a platform that rewards presentation. The best angle, the most compelling caption, the most shareable version of an opinion, the life that looks interesting enough to justify the follow. None of this is inherently malicious, but all of it is fundamentally curatorial, and curation, by definition, means selection. It means choosing what to show and what to withhold. It means constructing a version of yourself that is legible and appealing to a in an audience that doesn't know you, cannot know you, and is making rapid, shallow judgments based on a few pixels and a handful of words. For someone whose internal experience is rich, layered, contradictory, and constantly evolving, to which is precisely the kind of internal experience most empaths live inside. That curation process is not just tedious, it is a form of self-betrayal because the version of themselves that fits neatly into a post that can be communicated quickly and consumed easily is never quite the real version. It is always a reduction, and every time an empath produces that reduction, it produces a reduction. Every time they compress the full complexity of who they are into something digestible for a platform, their nervous system quietly notes the distance between the presented self and the actual self and files that distance as a source of low-grade psychological stress. This is why empaths often report feeling strangely hollow after crafting content that performed well. The likes came in, the comments were positive, the algorithm rewarded them, and yet something felt wrong. What felt wrong was the gap. The self that received the validation was not quite the self that needed it. The version of them that people were responding to was a managed version, a curated version, a version that had been processed through the filter of what the platform rewards, and the real self sitting behind that version received none of the genuine contact that makes visibility feel worthwhile in the first place. The mask got applauded, the face behind it remained unseen. There is a moment that almost every empath knows intimately, even if they have never had language for it. It is the moment after they have posted something. Anything, really. Something as simple as an opinion or an image or a small piece of their inner world made visible, and a critical response arrives. And what happens in that moment is not what most people would expect, and not what the person experiencing it can always explain. It is not simply a feeling of disappointment or embarrassment or the mild sting of disagreement that most people describe when they talk about negative feedback online. It is something more immediate than that, something more physical, something that lands in the chest or the stomach or somewhere along the spine before the conscious mind has even fully processed the words on the screen. It, Earth, arrives as sensation before it arrives as thought, and that sequence, body first, mind second, is not incidental. It is the entire story. The neuroscience behind this experience is not new, and it is not soft. In the early 2000s, researcher Naomi Eisenberger conducted a now landmark study using neuroimaging to examine what happens in the brain when a person experiences social rejection. The results were striking in a way that changed how researchers thought about social pain entirely. The regions of the brain that activated during social exclusion, COTAC, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, were the same regions that activate during physical pain. Not similar regions, not neighboring regions, the same regions. Social rejection and a physical blow were, from the brain's perspective, events of the same fundamental category. Pain is pain, and the brain does not always distinguish between the kind that comes from a fist and the kind that comes from a comment section. For the average person, this finding is interesting. For an empath, it is a precise description of lived experience, because what researchers identified in neuroimaging studies, empaths have been feeling in their bodies for their entire lives without anyone validating that what they were feeling was real and biological, rather than excessive and imaginary. When an empath reads a dismissive comment about something they shared, the pain is not metaphorical. It is not sensitivity being overdramatic. It is a nervous system responding to a genuine threat signal with a genuine pain response, processed through neural architecture that is, in the empath's case, particularly attuned to exactly this kind of social and emotional input. And here is where it becomes even more specific and even more important. Research on highly sensitive people, a population that overlaps substantially with empaths, consistently shows greater activation in the brain's mirror neuron system, the insula, and regions associated with emotional processing and empathic response. What this means in practice is that the same social pain response that Eisenberger documented in the general population is not just present in empaths, it is amplified. The signal that arrives when judgment lands is louder. The neural pathways that process social evaluation are more active, more responsive, more deeply engaged with the emotional content of what is happening. This is not a disorder. This is not a dysfunction. This is a nervous system operating at a higher resolution than average, which is extraordinary in many contexts and genuinely costly in this one. What makes the online environment particularly difficult for empaths in this regard is the quality of judgment that social media makes possible. In a physical interaction, judgment is constrained by social norms, by the presence of the other person, by the natural friction of face-to-face communication that slows things down and adds consequence to cruelty. Online, those constraints collapse almost entirely. A person can deliver a cutting assessment of your character, your appearance, your intelligence, or your worth in 6 words from behind a screen with no accountability and no awareness of what their words do when they land. For most people, that dynamic is unpleasant but manageable. For an empath whose nervous system processes that kind of social pain through the same neural machinery it uses to process physical injury, it is something closer to being struck repeatedly by people who cannot see that they are striking anyone at all. Their eye. Earth. Also a compounding dimension to this that rarely gets discussed. Empaths don't just feel their own pain in response to judgment, they frequently feel the emotional state of the person delivering it. The anger behind a hostile comment, the insecurity beneath a dismissive one, particular flavor of cruelty that comes from someone who is themselves in pain and has found a costless outlet for it. Where another person might receive a cruel comment and feel only the sting of its content, an empath often receives both the content and the emotional charge behind it simultaneously, absorbing not just the judgment, but the entire psychological weather system of the person who issued it. There's a story that the culture tells about people who are absent from social media, and it is not a generous one. The story goes something like this. They are afraid, they are behind, they are missing out, they are failing to build something that the modern world demands be built. The absence is read as a deficit, the silence is read as an inability. And for empaths who are already inclined to internalize the judgments of the world around them more deeply than most, that story can become something they believe about themselves, that their withdrawal from online spaces is evidence of a limitation, a reluctance they haven't yet overcome, a fear they haven't yet conquered, that if they were just a little braver, a little more resilient, a little more capable of doing what everyone else seems to do so effortlessly, they would be there, visible, consistent, present, in the way the algorithm rewards and the culture applauds. But that story is wrong, not partially wrong, not wrong in certain cases, fundamentally, structurally, psychologically wrong, because it misidentifies the nature of what is actually happening when a highly sensitive person steps back from the relentless demand of social media visibility. It mistakes a sophisticated self-protective response for a failure of courage. It mistakes an intelligent biological adaptation for an emotional shortcoming. And in doing so, it takes one of the most revealing pieces of evidence of an empath's psychological intelligence and reframes it as proof of their inadequacy. What is actually happening when an empath goes quiet online is not avoidance in the clinical sense, not the kind of avoidance that reinforces fear and shrinks the world. Over time. It is something more deliberate than that, even when it doesn't feel deliberate. It is the nervous system making a resource allocation decision. The empath's internal economy runs on a different energy currency than most people's, one that is spent faster in high stimulation, high exposure, high judgment environments, and replenished more slowly in quieter, more intimate, more authentic spaces. Social media is, by almost every measure, the highest stimulation, highest exposure, highest judgment environment that most people encounter in their daily lives. For a nervous system that processes all of that input at an amplified frequency, the decision to limit contact with that environment is not weakness. It is wisdom operating below the level of conscious articulation.